So good afternoon and welcome to our Software Resource Guide launch. We are very happy to welcome you here today online. Before we dive into the 40 proposed actions of the guide on who can do what to improve the digital safety of female journalists, I will briefly provide you some information on the technical details. So first of all, as we are all online and remotely, we would kindly ask you to turn off your camera unless you're one of the speakers or unless you're given the floor to speak. And please also mute yourself so that we don't have any background noise. In general, the connection is a little bit better if you're using a headset. And second of all, we will have two parts of the event. First, a presentation on the resource guide by its author, and then a panel discussion on what key stakeholders can do to improve the safety of women journalists online. You can engage in the discussions and we would encourage you to do so. You can do so in two different ways. First of all, you can send a request to take the floor to the Zoom co-host called floor request. You will see it in the participants list. And then you will be given the floor by the moderator and you can turn on your camera and your microphone and make a statement or ask a question directly to the speakers. The second option is you can also pose a question directly into the chat. If you're doing so, please send the question to Q&A request. You will also find that role in the participants. We will now start with a short campaign video of our software campaign.
So with this, I'd like to thank Julia Haas for introducing the technical details, and I'd like to start this meeting, the launch of our Safety of Female Journalists Online Resource Guide. With this one, we hope we could contribute to decrease this insecurity of female journalists that you just saw from the trailer of our film a dark place that can be, that we have offered different public service companies via the EBU to show in your different countries. To start, today we have several speeches, presenters, and I will start with our director, Jürgen Heisel. And if I can, I will show you my, full screen. I hope you see this. Yeah, I'm glad to say, to give to you that Jürgen Heisel, the Director of Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, he has 2 decades of experience in the Austrian Foreign Service. He has been covering human rights and security policy issues. He has been working in multilateral settings with organizations including the UN, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe. His posting prior to representative office was the permanent mission of Austria to the OSCE, where he, in 2017, was the coordinator of the human dimension during the Austrian OSCE chairmanship. And we are really happy and proud to have Jürgen as the director of the office presently. So please, Jürgen, as soon as I manage stopping sharing this PowerPoint, you can speak.
Thank you, Christine. Many thanks for this introduction. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of our new SoftStro resource guide. It's a guide that aims to assist states and non-state actors across the OSCE region in taking real action to improve the safety of female journalists online. It's a guide with practices and examples of ways in which international standards and commitments can be realized. It's a guide that, providing 40 proposed actions, points to a systemic approach for key actors that are essential for creating a safe and enabling media environment. Unfortunately, such guidance is still definitely needed. Online harassment and attacks, particularly against women journalists, have become increasingly prevalent over the last years, including during the last months of the ongoing pandemic. Gender-based online abuse often includes threats of rape and physical violence, graphic imagery, and sexualized attacks. Such attempts to silence critical voices are undermining our core democratic values. Today, on the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, let me particularly emphasize that almost all women journalists facing offline harm have previously been subject to online attacks, often in a sexualized and gender-specific form. Ending impunity is therefore not only crucial to ensure justice, but also to prevent future attacks. It is essential that governments condemn attacks against journalists, both online and offline, that perpetrators are prosecuted and preventive action are taken. Unfortunately, there remains a lack of understanding, both from law enforcement and the judiciary across the OSCE region, about protection against online harm. In many instances, it is even political figures who play a role in online harassment, either directly or by not condemning such attacks and thereby contributing to a general climate of impunity. Since the launch of the RFOM's SoftStro project back in 2015, we have focused on raising awareness in a bid to inspire change. This includes our documentary, A Dark Place, that we produced in cooperation with the International Press Institute. It was first screened in December 2018 and has since then proven to be a powerful tool to spur discussions on this crucial topic. Since the beginning, one of our main priorities has been to help all stakeholders to identify the gaps in their response to online harassment and to help them protect female journalists. Throughout the project, the office has focused on developing collective strategies and on sharing tools and resources for female journalists who have been targeted. The Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media has developed several publications, supported research, and provided recommendations to various stakeholders. Now, however, with this resource guide, we've developed a comprehensive, hands-on, and very detailed guide on who can take which concrete action and on how to improve the online safety of women journalists. I would like to take this opportunity to pronounce my particular thanks to the authors of the guide, in particular Dr. Silvia Ciuccaro, and also Sarah Clark, Paulina Guterres, and Judy Tang, for the great and very intensive cooperation with the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media throughout this year, but their extensive research and compilation of concrete actions, good practice examples, and resources. With your help, we were able to develop this comprehensive approach to countering online harassment of female journalists. I also want to thank our donor countries who have supported the project from the beginning and both directly and indirectly enabled this publication. Special thanks go to Austria, the Czech Republic, Ireland, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States. In addition, I would like to thank our speakers who join us this afternoon on the panel to share their expertise and contribute to the discussion on the issues female journalists are facing online, and more importantly, what they and what all of us can do to improve their digital safety. It is time to take the next step and to walk the talk. I'm looking forward to today's discussions, and I'm confident that the publication will provide guidance for concrete actions to improve the digital safety of women journalists and thereby to enhance media pluralism and the quality of our democracies. Thank you very much, and I wish us all a good meeting and fruitful discussions.
Thank you, Jürgen. I'd like to say a few words before we start the speakers. My name is Kristin Olsson. I'm the Principal Advisor of the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, and I'm also a manager for the software project at the moment. So what you will have today is different presentations, and we'll later on have a panel discussion where you're also free to post questions, as Julia gave instructions on before, for example, via the chat Q&A, address Q&A. Let me tell you, just give me a recap of the issues you've been informed about in the invitation to this event. This is our new publication, right? This is what we will talk about today. For those who are part of the OSCE delegation, in your pigeonhole in Hofburg, you also have a fact sheet. You can download it online, where there is a beautiful image that I will come back to, and all the 40 proposed actions and some information. And all of you can also download to put on the wall a nice poster where all the actions, proposed actions, and the actors are included. So this very hands-on introduction is to tell you that what we have started off from all the experience from the resource, from the software project of the RFOM office, and try to look forward. So we know what to be done. Now, how can it be done in concretely at national levels? What can be done by different actors, as Jürgen said? And we address 10 different actors. And I'd like to also say that we are very much interested in having these proposed actions, this 40 proposed action and this common approach on gender responsiveness to be implemented at national level. So please contact us and relate to us, phone us, email us for any kind of ideas you have how we can cooperate on this. Now, I will try to share the screen again. So here you are. So just a few short words. What we tried to do was as Jürgen said, map the gap between talking and doing. And on a very concrete level for the participating states to be able to work on it on all the stakeholders of relevance in the media sector. So we have this beautiful content that Silvia Chocarro soon will describe in short. Each of the proposed action and each of the actor is related to the decision that was taken in consensus by all the 57 OSCE states in 2018. It's the OSCE ministerial decision on safety of journalists. So each actor and each proposed action relates to different parts of this decision. So hence, the publication is a way to show how this decision can be implemented, basically. We thank, of course, the authors, the 4 main authors that has been working on this, as Jürgen said. So the 10 actors are these 10 groups that we have illustrated here, a beautiful illustration by Penno Mishoyan in Armenia. This is actually, I would argue that this is a presentation of the key actors within the enabling environment of media. enabling environment and media, a concept that is often used and very little understood actually. And these actors can be used for different media freedom related topics like financial sustainability. What does it take to create financial sustainability? Hence, what should all these actors do? Today we talk about the safety of female journalists online. And I would let Dr. Silvia Sciuccaro describe more about the work she and her colleagues has done in cooperation with the office. Silvia Sciuccaro is the head of protection of journalists and human rights defenders at the NGO Article 19. She's a journalist and freedom of expression advocate. She also sits on the council of IFEX and is a member of specialist bodies at the University of Sheffield and the Central European University. For the last 20 years, Silvia Sciuccaro has focused on promoting the human rights to freedom of expression in various capacities, building a comprehensive and holistic approach to this issue. She has worked for news outlets, civil society groups, and intergovernmental organizations such as UNESCO, where she works on the development of the very important UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity that has created a lot of difference globally. She has authored several publications on gender and media, and we're proud that she managed this publication. The floor is yours, Silvia.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christine. Good afternoon, everyone, Excellencies. First of all, I would like to thank the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media for counting on us to write this resource guide about such an important issue as online harassment and abuse against women journalists. I also want to thank the other co-authors, Sarah Clark, Paulina Gutierrez, and Judy Tang, and of course the OSCE team, and in particular Christine Olson, who has worked very close with us. The fact that women journalists are increasingly being harassed online is not a secret. One just needs to open any social media platform and you will find plenty of examples. And what you would see might shock you. Here, there are a few examples from the documentary, A Dark Place, produced by the OSCE and the International Press Institute, and we just saw the trailer a few minutes ago. So these are the examples of things that you might find on online harassment and abuse. Is there no brave fellow who could blow the fire out of this fiery beach? Does anyone know where she lives? Or which places she regularly visits? Tonight, they will rape you. One might think that this is just the way it is in the virtual world, but there is nothing virtual about online harassment and abuse. In the worst case scenario, online threats translate into physical attacks. And meanwhile, the impact on women journalists, it's enormous, and in the society as a whole too. The emotional consequences range from anxiety to depression or to fear of going out from home, which actually has also impact physically. Many women journalists who have the subject, who have been the subject of online harassment and abuse, have considered quitting the profession. They have even avoided reporting on certain issues. So we also see how online harassment and abuse has an impact on access to information for all of us and how this is undermined. According to recent studies, more than 50% of the cases go unreported, either because their importance are minimized or because there was the impression that nothing would be done. So we are here today because we think that something should and actually can be done, and that something must be done. And this is at the core of the OSCE research guide on the safety of female journalists that we are presenting today. So as it was mentioned before, this guide proposes a series of concrete actions, 40 to be exact, and one common approach to address online harassment and abuse against women journalists. What is this common approach? It is a gender responsive one. And why is this so important? Because violence against women, and in this case, women journalists, does not take place in a vacuum. All around the world, women and girls suffer from various forms of discrimination, denying them of their human rights, such as the right to freedom of expression, which actually plays an essential role in ending inequality. So what will you find in this resource guide? As it was mentioned, you will find 40 actions to promote the safety of women journalists online. These actions are presented in 10 chapters. The first 5 chapters are dedicated to state actors and the other 5 to non-state actors. Each chapter includes 3 types of inputs. First, a brief explanation of the proposed actions. 2, a selection of examples, of existing examples and measures that have been put in place somewhere in some of the countries in the OSCE region. And 3, a list of useful resources. You will actually find more than 300 references and resources. As Christine was mentioning before, the guide emerges from the OSCE Ministerial Council Decision 318 on the safety of journalists, which express a specific concern, and I quote, on the distinct risks faced by women journalists in relation to their work, and recognizes that attacks come in many forms, such as sexual harassment, abuse, intimidation, threats, violence, including through digital technologies. So let's look at some of the proposed actions. I'm going to go through each of the chapters and give you a few ideas of what you will find in each of these chapters. The first chapter is dedicated to the executive branch of government. And I must say, there is one very easy and maybe very obvious action for creating a safe environment for women journalists. Government and public officials must refrain from using derogatory and misogynistic language against them, and they have to publicly condemn any attack. It is also crucial for governments to speak whenever possible about the important role of journalism in society. And actually, in this regard, the guide proposes specifically to include media and information literacy in schools to increase the understanding of the role of journalism and the way internet and social media platforms operate. We also think that government has a role to play in promoting a coordinated strategy among the various branches of the state, and do so in cooperation with non-state actors. So the guide proposes the creation of national action plans on the safety of journalists or protection mechanisms. And of course, what we propose is that those have to address the specific conditions for women journalists offline and online. There are various examples included in the guide from which to draw lessons on this. For example, in the Netherlands, Sweden, Italy, Serbia, more recently in the United Kingdom. Often these protection mechanisms can take the form of a law. So now for chapter 2, which is about the legislative branch. So first of all, having proper legislation for safeguarding women journalists starts with a legal framework that effectively recognizes and protects the right to equality and non-discrimination. When it comes to online harassment and abuse, new specific legislation may not always be the best response. Many times it is a matter of adapting existing law. It is also about considering a diverse and complementary response to address the problem through civil and administrative law, but also through public policies, awareness campaigns, research, training, education. The OSCE, for example, has published a few reports analyzing the details of how existing law has been used to address online harassment and abuse in, for example, Finland, France, and Ireland. You can also find these examples in the guide. It is also crucial to ensure that legislation does not lead to undue restrictions that could undermine the rights of the very women for whom governments may seek to provide redress. For example, vaguely formulated laws and regulations that prohibit nudity or obscenity could unintentionally have a chilling effect on critical discussions about sexuality, gender, and reproductive health. But a law is only as strong as its interpretation and application. So in chapter 3, we look at the judiciary. Studies show that in many cases, women journalists do not take any action when they are the subject of online harassment and abuse. So the guide proposes for the judiciary to take proactive measures that can facilitate access to justice for women through procedures that are easily accessible and gender sensitive. There are various guidelines on this too. You can find them on the guide, like for example, one that has been developed by the OSCE that is called Justice and Gender. The guide also considers a priority to increase expertise among the judiciary about the right to freedom of expression, gender equality, and digital technologies. We think that training for the judiciary, it's a very important part of addressing online harassment and abuse. And on this, for example, UNESCO and the Council of Europe have organized this type of trainings. And there are also examples of states that have taken some sort of trainings in this line, like for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And talking about training is also one of the main proposed actions for the law enforcement, which is the focus of Chapter 4. As with the judiciary, we believe that it's important to increase knowledge. That is, it's more than important, it's crucial to increase knowledge on law enforcement, on freedom of expression, press freedom, and non-discrimination, but also on the use and misuse of digital technologies. Programs that improve mutual understanding between police and journalists have also proven to be useful, to know better what is the work of each other. And for example, this type of dialogues between police and law enforcement have taken place in countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan in collaboration with UNESCO. Or for example, in Canada, the Canadian Department of Justice has a handbook for police on how to address harassment. When it comes specifically to investigating crimes against journalists, there is evidence that criminal investigations have lagged. The guide proposes creating or strengthening specific protocols to investigate crimes against journalists. And in this regard, it is of great importance that these protocols are saying that we need to exhaust the line of inquiry that links the attack to the profession, to the work, to the journalistic work of the victim. This line of inquiry needs to be exhausted. Moreover, the guide proposes to create specific units within the police and prosecutorial offices to investigate crimes against journalists. For example, the police in Kosovo assigned its Department of Serious Crimes to investigate attacks against journalists. And I'm going to Chapter 5, which is the last chapter about state actors. And Chapter 5 focuses on intergovernmental organizations. While in recent years, there has been an unprecedented number of resolutions on the safety of journalists. There has been more than 10. And this actually has included more and more the issue of violence against women journalists in particular, but also in particular online harassment and abuse. This is very welcome. However, we propose that intergovernmental organizations do more to make sure that these standards are actually implemented at the national level. And for this, we propose that intergovernmental organizations strengthen and reinforce their technical assistance to states to make sure that words become actions. And practical guides, like the one we are presenting today, are a good example on trying to support the implementation of these standards. So let's look now at the chapters on non-state actors, which is the other 5 chapters of the guide. An important actor, and is the Chapter 6, is Internet Intermediaries. We focus the chapter more on social media platforms in particular. And social media platforms are the double-edged swords of the internet. They are both the space for exercising the right to freedom of expression, but because of that, it's also the space where harassment and abuse manifest. So for this precise reason, internet intermediaries must align their business practices with international human rights standards, including freedom of expression and privacy, and with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. With social media platforms, it is all about ensuring transparency, clarity, and accessibility. To what? To their policies and terms of reference, to their community guidelines, to their tools for content removals, and to their reporting and appeal mechanisms. And on a practical level, the guide proposes internet intermediaries to conduct regular assessments or audits of their impact on human rights, such as freedom of expression, privacy, non-discrimination. And we propose that based on these assessments and these human rights audits, based on the findings, put measures in place. And of course, do so in collaboration and in a participatory manner with users impacted by online harassment and abuse, such as women journalists in this case. So we go to chapter 7. And in chapter 7, we are looking at the safety of women journalists and media outlets, which media outlets are actually the first layer of protection and support for women journalists, because safety starts in the workplace. So the first step for media outlets is to put in place safety policies that include, obviously, online harassment and abuse. And this includes undertaking risk assessments, design safety plans and protection measures, providing digital safety security training for their journalists. And all of this, of course, while taking into account the specific risks women face offline and online. There are also a lot of very useful tools to guide media outlets in this process. And there are also examples of media outlets that have actually put this in place. That are also mentioned in the guide. One of them, for example, are the guides that have been produced by the International Press Institute and by the World Association of Newspapers. But for media outlets, it's also important, of course, all this preventive work and protection work, but it's also crucial what we do after the fact. So we propose that after the fact support is also a must for media outlets. This might include legal aid, psychological help, put in place peer support networks within the media outlets for staff, and this is very important, also for freelancers that work for them. On this, you are also going to find many examples and resources on the guide. So I'm going now to chapter 8, which is about journalist associations, unions, and self-regulatory bodies. These institutions, journalist associations and unions, work to promote equal working conditions in the first place. So they can initiate awareness-raising campaigns, training programs, legal and psychological support. The International Federation of Journalists, for example, and their national members have produced many tools and campaigns specifically on online harassment and abuse against women journalists. These groups are also very well placed to monitor attacks in order to develop solutions. As well as media outlets, they can also monitor and process information on specific cases of online attacks. Why it's important for them to monitor specific cases? Because evidence will be needed every time there is a case of online harassment and abuse against a woman journalist. And it is not always easy for women being under attack to do so, to monitor themselves, what's happening to them. Actually, having been a target of online harassment myself, I can assure you that the sheer volume of violent messages is overwhelming, to the point that one might be paralyzed and not being able to do this monitoring work. It's going to provide evidence. So support from these organizations, from these peer organizations and media outlets to do so can be critical too. Also from civil society, which is actually the focus of chapter 9, together with educational institutions. One of the roles that civil society has played, and they are very strong too, is monitoring attacks against journalists. In recent years, monitoring online harassment has been increased by civil society organizations, but actually monitoring online harassment and abuse in a very systematic way can be pretty challenging. Still, CSOs are finding ways to carry out reports that are shedding light on the issue. And while there has been a considerable increase in research on this topic, we propose to identify research gaps and produce additional research, and actually do so in cooperation with other organizations, like, for example, academia and educational institutions that can really strengthen that research. Because civil society groups could propose the research question, and academia could help civil society organizations to answer the question. And civil society plays a unique role also in raising awareness, and above all on mobilizing communities for holding governments accountable. So we propose expanding their allies to other actors so they can make a stronger case. Chapter 10, the last chapter, is dedicated to women journalists individually. So this chapter provides specific recommendations to them on self-protection to prevent, mitigate, and respond to attacks. And it calls for supporting colleagues who are facing online harassment and abuse. There are many examples and resources for women journalists that you will find on the guide that have been produced by many organizations around the world. So, as this guide shows, there are actually many steps that can be taken. Online harassment and abuse is not part of the job. We all have a role to play, and states an obligation. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for your very comprehensive overview of the 10 chapters and the 10 key actors. And with this, that maybe we already go to the second part, and where we will more go into detail into the representatives of 3 particular key actors to present what their role and their experience has been. And Sylvia, thanks for sticking around. We will have a Q&A afterwards where we can discuss also with the audience how to proceed. So thank you very much. And Hannah, Sharna, I can already see you. Thank you very much. Or maybe I hand over now to Kristen again as she's here. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for helping me. I was thrown out. Some things happen digitally, but here I am, and I'm glad to see you as well, Hannah. And you will speak. Now we will enter into a session, part of this, event, where we will hear from 3 different representatives talking about different chapters. And I'm really pleased that you will talk about the media outlet chapter of the publication. I will share here. So can you see it? Yeah. So here, now you can see the proposed actions to media outlets. And while it's it's for them, and is to prove them workplace and should ensure support and training, develop gender responsive community guidelines for the platforms, and monitor and document online abuse and harassment, basically are the proposed questions. And let us hear Hanna Stjärna, the Chief Executive Officer at Sweden's National Autonomous Broadcaster, Swedish Television. And Hanna Stjärna started her journalistic career as a reporter, news anchor, and foreign correspondent at Sveriges Radio, or Swedish Radio. And she was moving on to various management positions at the company. And she eventually left public service to become CEO and editor-in-chief at the newspaper Uppsala Nya Tidning. During her leadership, the paper was awarded several prizes, among them a prize for Best Digital Cultural Journalism. In 2010, Stjärna was awarded Best Female Media Executive in Sweden. In 2014, she left commercial media to return to public service as she was appointed CEO of SVT, Swedish Television. A new vision for SVT has been launched during her leadership. And the motto is, we contribute to a more informed and inquisitive Sweden. And she has focused strongly on digitalization and creating a modern public service company that engages all of Sweden. I hand over the floor to you, Hanna.
Thank you. I should put up the presentation. Let's see. Thank you, and dear all, I'm very honored to speak today on the subject of the safety of female journalists online. A threat to a journalist is a threat against democracy and freedom of speech. These are also the very pillars of our society, and this subject is really urgent today because things are not getting better, things are actually getting worse. And 7 years ago, in 2013, SVT's leading program for investigative journalism, they published a story called Men Who Harass Women Online. And this program featured journalists, female journalists, writers and bloggers who had one thing in common. They had all been harassed online. And this program, this investigative program, was actually quite simple. The women sat down, they were still, they were against just a black backdrop, and they read themselves aloud the harassments that they had received, just looking straight into the camera. And it was very plain, it was very simple, and it was extremely strong. It was chilling and it was terrifying to watch these women reading out the harassments. And one of the women in this program was this lady, Anna Hedemo. She's the news anchor of SVT's prime time news program Aktuellt. This program is broadcast every night at 9 o'clock, and it reaches a huge audience all throughout Sweden. And in the investigative program, Anna told the story of how she had been threatened over a long period of time. And she told how she started getting really scared when the threats also were directed directly towards her family. And these testimonials from all these female journalists made the impact of the investigative program really huge. All over Sweden, people were shocked about the online threats and about just hearing, viewing journalists reading them out. And in the debate that followed, most everyone agreed this has got to come to an end. That was 7 years ago. And today, 7 years later, we know what happened. It didn't stop. It got worse. Because this fall, another female news anchor, and this is her name is Nikki Nilander. She just made an interview in the same program, 9 o'clock news at Swedish television. It was an interview with a Swedish politician, and she got threats. She got death threats also directed towards her family. You don't seem to be worried about your kids. If I were you, I would be. Just wait and see. That was one of the threats that she received. And although, as always, there was an editor that was in charge of this program, all the hatred was directed directly towards Nikki, the female anchor. So looking back at these 7 years, what has happened is that the threats are becoming more individuals, not the companies. They're going directly towards individuals because the haters know that the impact would be greater. As the publication that is discussed here today, Safety of Female Journalists Online, it so correctly points out, an attack on an individual journalist is an attack on the entire outlet, and it must always be treated as such. So that was one thing that has happened. The threats are mostly directed towards persons, towards female journalists in person. And what else has happened? If we look at the national level in Sweden, Sweden is no longer now, it used to be, but it's no longer now the safest country in the world when it comes to the security for journalists. During these last years, Sweden has actually sunk to number 4 in the yearly report from Reporters Without Borders. And that's mostly due to threats online towards journalists and mostly due to threats online towards female journalists. And at SVT nowadays, this is a picture showing this, we handle on average 35 security issues every day, all year round. 35 security issues every day. And this includes harassment, acts of violence, threats. It's both physical and digital. And every day we report incidents to the Swedish police. Our costs for security, as you can see, are 4 times higher now than they were 5 years ago. And a very big part of the costs, they are for personal protection of journalists. Since the threats goes more towards individuals, our costs for protecting individuals has risen, and it's extremely high right now. And this also means that a lot of money that was meant to finance journalism and new programs is now spent on security. Keeping our staff safe is, of course, our highest priority. So this was the situation right now. But looking forward, what's next? What could we expect from the coming 7 years? Well, if you speak on this subject, it's really easy to paint a very dark picture of the future. But of course, it's essential to focus on the factors that have been successful up until now. And these are some of the things that we have been looking at SVT. So if you look at our newsroom, this publication points out that women journalists' lack of safety frequently starts within the workplace. And I think that empowering women and specifically of encouraging female leadership, that has been an area where SVT has been very successful. I'm actually the 4th female CEO at SVT in a row. And out of all our managers in the company, 56% are women, 44% are men, and 56% are women. The majority of our managers are women today. And although bad things also happened in Sweden, I'm certain that this means something for the culture in the newsroom and the status of a female journalist. Another thing that I would like to address too is the thing that we call land courage. As the risk of self-censorship is high when you're exposed to harassment, we need sort of a package of tools to ensure that we are never steering away from controversial subjects, that we can report about everything despite threats. And this package of, you could call them safety tools that we have at SVT, they include continuous security education for journalists, risk analysis and proactive involvement from our security department, careful preparations before publishing your story together with the editor. If you know your material as a journalist in every detail and you talk it through in the newsroom with colleagues and with your editor, that will take the pressure more off the single journalist. And that will also make it easier to act collectively against the haters. And the last thing that I would like to address is legislation. If society's support for threatened journalists isn't increased, the already pressured media companies will need to handle the rising costs of security. It should never be risk-free to threaten a journalist. More haters need to be prosecuted, and there has to be severe consequences if you attack a journalist. And in Sweden right now, there's an ongoing commission of inquiry looking over the possibility to increase the punishment for those threatening journalists. And this is really a good step forward. But again, it's really urgent. And it is important to stress that the safety of journalists is not the responsibility only for the media companies. The safety of journalists is absolutely not the responsibility for the threatened journalists themselves. The safety of journalists is the responsibility for us, for everyone. A threat against a journalist is a threat against democracy and freedom of speech, the very pillars of our society. And the subject is very urgent. Things are not getting better. They are actually getting worse. And as a final remark, if I could make one wish for the years to come, that would be that no journalist should ever feel that she has to look over her shoulder when she leaves the office at night.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for that presentation and for painting the picture of what it's like as a manager of a big media company. In this part of the event where we discuss from different, we get presentations from different chapters, we will listen to Monica Hanisch, who will talk about the judiciary and legislative chapters, and then we will hear Thomas Hughes, who will talk about the intergovernment intermediaries afterwards. So, please share.
Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, thank you very much.
Can you wait a little bit? I know you have. I hope your connection works where you are. We have different connection problems today. So first, before we talk, I want to give you, introduce you to the audience, and also introduce the chapter you will talk about. So there are, now we will come to legislative branch of government and possibly also to the judiciary. They are very close to each other. So Monica Hanisch will talk about these proposed actions that we suggest and what it could mean. She's a legal counselor at the Office of the Government Agent before the European Court of Human Rights from the Ministry of Justice of the Czech Republic. She's a jurist with a focus on human rights, media law, and new technologies. And Monica Hanisch is currently, she works currently at the European Court and teaches at Masaryk University. She is a member of the Committee on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights by the Council of Europe, and she's also a member of the Czech Center for Human Rights and Democracy. Now, Monica, thank you for your patience. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Christine. Sorry, because I thought that we cannot hear you, so I already started. So sorry for the disruption and misunderstanding. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, good afternoon. I hope that you are still enjoying your cup of coffee and it is not too bitter after all we heard and we saw from all the quotations of female journalists. So let me now start with one concrete example. It's also from Scandinavia, even though we were not somehow connected to Harass, so it's not from Sweden, but from Finland, which is actually also one of the countries which is usually supposed and it's being the most safe for all the journalists. Despite that, I would like to show on this case that it's not everything in this online world is not untouching also Finland or Scandinavia or different countries. So the case is actually the case of Jessica Aro. Maybe you know it, you know her, because she's very famous Finnish journalist, a reporter who is actually investigating, or she was investigating for many years about the existence of pro-Russian troll factories. It was really in the beginning. So actually she was one of the first to bring the topic on the table into the newspaper and on the televisions and online. But unfortunately, the other side of the coin was that there was also a 4-year harassment campaign against her, which was started by the other side because some of the people didn't like the topic, of course, she covered, because it was very sensitive despite its importance. What was the good news was that actually once she made a claim to the police, so the public prosecutor and police started to investigate the case, and finally they investigated 9 persons, from which 3 were actually prosecuted and convicted of aggravated defamation, incitement to aggravated defamation, also stalking, copyright infringement, hate speech, etc. So this was a very important message for all the journalists in Finland and also abroad, that actually these cases could be won and they could be followed by the judiciary. Also that there are some legislation tools which can be actually used for this kind of online harassment. On the other hand, what was a little bit striking, as you can see, there was a 4 years harassment online campaign against her, also death threats, all these intimidating family attacks, etc., as already mentioned before, very similar to these ones. And only 3 of all those people were actually convicted. And they were convicted, 2 of them were convicted of suspended sentence, 1 of given sentence for 1 year and several months. It's not being a really high number of people who are being prosecuted by it. So I would say this is one of the first problems we can see also for law enforcement, for legislation, and also for judiciary, because these are connected tools together, which has to be used, because otherwise the cases are just theoretical ones, and the journalists can be lost in the numbers of all these harassment messages. Another coin in this Finnish case was that actually once there was used this criminal intent of stalking, or this criminal threats were let down under the stalking. This paragraph, actually, this provision could be actually used only if the reporter itself, if the female journalist or the journalist or anyone else who was actually being touched by it was actually able to do the complaint by himself or herself. So it was not that the prosecutor could start proactively these cases. So I would say this is another problem, for example, in this Finnish mechanism, that actually, unless there was a very important public interest, which would require that charges would be brought by public prosecutor, it had to be the journalist herself to actually bring the action, which can be also very difficult once you need to focus on your job, once you need to cover your reports and your journalistic job, and you need to deal with hundreds or thousands of these harassment messages. It can be also psychologically or physically very stressful, actually, to bring it to the police or to the eye of the public prosecutor. So this is another point from this Finnish case. And also, I would say for the legislation, it is really needed, and it was also shown by the Finnish case that once you're a legislator, you really need to go into detail of your legislation. Why? For example, once there was this provision of stalking used by the Finnish authorities, it was applied only where there has been a contact between the accused and the journalist, which means once there was direct message, that was okay, but what about if there was some kind of indirect message, if there was a tagging or fake profiles, if there was anything else which can be done online? So is this a real contact between the accused and the journalist? Then the burden of proof is very difficult. Actually, it's very difficult to prove that there has been such a contact, and actually to punish this kind of perpetrator. And this is not nothing very special, because in the online space we can see that this is quite normal, that there has been hundreds of tagged photos or comments, for example, of several journalists, also of Jessica Arrow from the Finnish case. But let me now focus more also on the legislation part first, and then also we will see a little bit more on the judiciary and law enforcement agencies. Maybe a good practice can be seen from various countries who already actually updated their laws. So I would say, if you would like to start and you are the one who actually can influence the legislation of your country, start with analysis of your internal national law and legal provisions of online harassment, of abuse, of intimidation, because sometimes we could see that these provisions are only meant for offline harassment, for example, usually stalking provisions, they are usually thought about that some person is actually stalking the other on the street or to her house or in the offline content. But what we now very much need is also to focus on the online side of the coin. So for example, there are great cases of Canada, France, Finland, but also Germany or Spain already have existing laws which prohibits breaches of privacy and also prohibits online harassment and are really focused also on the online space. So these can be used as the examples of good practice. Another side of the coin is actually that once we really want to stir up upon this intimidation and harassment, we also don't want to undermine the right to freedom of expression, which is already mentioned also by previous speakers, that actually we still need actually to have free flow of information and discussions about even such those important topics which are very, very controversial about gender, or that there was mentioned reproductive health and so on. So on the other hand, there has to be this very sensitive balance between how to stir up the hatred, how to really focus on intimidation and harassment online, but also how to preserve also the freedom of expression. There is also one case of France who modified its legislation in 2018. Actually, France modified its criminal code that now actually it enables to public prosecutor to prosecute the harassment, which is committed also by the group of people through the online of use communication services, which was not possible before, and it is actual reaction for what is happening now within the public online space. So this is another good examples we can see. As I mentioned, actually, the legislation itself is only one part. We can see it also from this OSCE Sophio guide, because there are 10 actors who are crucial, and I'm now speaking only about 2 to 3 because this is my part. So I mentioned the legislation, but the legislation itself, as we can know from our practice, it is only some kind of theory which really needs to be done in practice by law enforcement agencies at first, and then by the judiciary. So it's some kind of circle which needs to fit in together, to work together. Otherwise, it's not effective protection for female journalists and for the other victims of this online harassment. So I would say, as we could saw from the Finnish case, public prosecutor or police should be much more proactively searching and investigating these cases. It should not be only reaction or reactive, and also they should do it in a timely manner. As we know from many different cases, judiciary but also this kind of persecution, it can take, in better cases, this is usually months, but it can also take years. And once you are a journalist and you really need to focus on your job to do a really good, important coverage of different topics, you don't want to be on everyday stress by being, you know, followed or stalked by someone, by being online harassed. So you want to have these cases really being quickly done. Yeah, there is another case you will probably know very well. It's also a case of Malta of unfortunately murdered journalist Daphne Galizia, who was actually also, before she was murdered, because she was also writing and covering this controversial topic on corruption and public estates. So she was also online harassed. So as we can see, it's not always only the online space which is actually being touched. It was also mentioned also in the film, a dark place, which you could see, or you can see it also the other days, because there's a shared link in the chat I saw. But as it was also mentioned by the previous speakers, it doesn't mean that once these online harassment or threats are being done in online content, it doesn't mean that they will not be also able to be continued within the offline content. So we have to be aware by that as well. One really striking judgment from my country, from the Czech Republic. Czech Republic was saying that also it's not actually so important whether this kind of harassment or threat was really fulfilled, but the intent itself. This is the crucial what should actually be focused on by the public prosecutor, police, and also then by judiciary, which now is switching me to this judiciary perspective. So I would say first, as I already mentioned, the intent is what you should focus on. Then I would say also please focus on this victim's perspective, because sometimes we have this kind of tendency to forget about the victim. So I would say not only the punishment for actual perpetrator, but the damages and for all the suffering, for all the distress of psychological or physical nature. This is all very important actually to be discussed through the judiciary, through the judgments. So this victim's perspective, I would say, is one of the most key elements actually to focus on by the judiciary. Then there is this reputational aspect. So there can be professional credit lost, etc. And last but not least, I know I'm running out of time, is that actually I would very much plead not only for the trainings of judiciary, but also to share information about sentences. One last example, which is very controversial for me and striking, is that actually there was one hate speech Czech case, and the sentences for very similar hateful comments were from the specter of €4 financial punishment, up to €600 punishment, up to a suspended sentence for 2 years. So these decisions and punishment were varied so widely that I would plead for much more information sharing by the judiciary. So this is a very brief note on legislation and judiciary. I don't have more time for any more notes, but I am looking forward to discussion. Please feel free to ask for any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monika Hanisch, for this presentation and for your reflections. And I will repeat your invitation to questions. Please post your questions on the chat, either addressing floor requests or addressing Q&A requests. And we will have the last presentation before we start our Q&A session at the moment. I go back to the book that we are here to celebrate today, where with the different 10 actors. And Monika just spoke about the legislative branch of government and the judiciary. And now we'll go to internet intermediaries, both social media platforms and other kinds of internet intermediaries that influences the space for freedom of expression. And there are 5 proposed actions to respect international human rights standards, make sure that policies on content moderation are clear and accessible and transparent for the users, and adopt user-centered approaches and non-discriminatory approaches in all operations. Handle content removals and users' data requests with transparency. Promote the role of women journalists. And who would be better to talk about this than Thomas Hughes? Thomas Hughes is the director of the Oversight Board Administration, which was set up to make binding decisions regarding content on Facebook and Instagram. Between 2013 and early 2020, Hughes was executive director of Article 19, the international human rights organization that defends and promotes freedom of expression. Before that, he was executive director and founder of Diversity. It's an international advertising network for online news media in human rights restricted countries. Also a co-founder of virtualworld.org, a secure hosting service for the same audience. Thomas Hughes has also worked as Deputy Director of International Media Support, IMS, in Denmark, and has had roles within the EU, UN, and OSCE. Thomas Hughes was an independent human rights advisor to UK foreign secretaries between 2016 and 2019, and he is a non-political governor at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kristen, and my thanks also to the Office of the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media for the invitation to join you for this panel today. As I think everyone has done before me, I'd really like to start by recognizing the numerous women journalists who have struggled with harassment and abuse online, as the video that we saw at the very start really showed us in very vivid detail. I'd also like to congratulate the authors of the resource guide, who I should note, for full disclosure, do include a number of my own former colleagues. And this guide is just the sort of action-oriented tool that is needed. Having looked at the actions proposed for internet intermediaries and self-regulatory bodies as well, I'm going to focus obviously my remarks on those. But before doing so, I just wanted to start off by clarifying what the Oversight Board is and what its role will be vis-a-vis Facebook and Instagram. So for those of you who are new to the Oversight Board, it's comprised of independent members from around the world who will make final and binding decisions on what content Facebook and Instagram should allow or remove based on respect for freedom of expression and human rights. The week before last, we announced that the board is ready to hear cases from both users who want to appeal Facebook's decision to remove their content, and also content moderation decisions referred by Facebook itself, covering both content that is left up and taken down. Since we announced our first 20 members, we've been building an institution equipped to make binding independent decisions on the most challenging content issues facing Facebook and Instagram users. In this endeavor, our members have been guided by the goal of developing an institution that can make thorough, principled, and globally relevant decisions. They've studied Facebook and Instagram's existing processes and practices for dealing with content issues and worked together to determine how they will select and decide cases, as well as participated in mock case deliberations to practice and refine their approach. Our focus has been on building an institution that is not just about reacting to a single moment or chasing a specific news cycle, but about protecting human rights and free expression for the long term. The board is the first institution of its kind and has been empowered to make decisions that could potentially impact many millions or even many billions of Facebook and Instagram users around the world. In building this institution, our first principle has always therefore been to ensure that we make the correct steps to get it right. My role as Director of the Oversight Board Administration is, together with the other professional staff who have been employed in the administration, is to support the board members as they select, review, and deliberate on cases, as well as to report to the trustee on the fiduciary aspects of the trust fund. So I'd now like to reflect on the board in relation to the proposed actions for internet intermediaries and self-regulatory bodies. So the first, respect for international human rights standards on freedom of expression, privacy, participation, and non-discrimination. So relating to this, the board is publicly committed to ensuring that its decisions respect international human rights standards, which may mean that we ask Facebook to prioritize such standards when reinstating or removing content. The board members are also committed to making decisions with consideration for human rights, and importantly, without any consideration to the economic, political, or reputational interests of Facebook or Instagram. Secondly, to make sure that policies on content moderation are clear, transparent, accessible for users. So regarding this action, the board is seeking to develop its procedures in line with Principle 31 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, of which you will be familiar. And this means to be legitimate by seeking to be accountable for the fair conduct of our procedures, accessible by ensuring users know about the ability to appeal, and for third parties to contribute. We will also be looking into specific ways to help vulnerable and marginalized individuals access the board. To be predictable by publishing our bylaws and procedures, whilst reporting will allow external parties to monitor our actions. To be equitable by exploring how users might access the advice and expertise necessary to be able to appeal. To be transparent by keeping users informed about their appeals and reporting publicly about the work of the board and its decisions. To be rights compatible, as mentioned previously, by seeking to ensure that decisions respect international human rights standards. And finally, by being a source of continuous learning through engagement from external parties to help us understand what is working well and also what is not working well. So returning to the guides and its actions. So the third is to adopt user-centered and non-discriminatory based approaches in all operations. So as noted, we are looking at ways to address the rights and needs of individuals from groups or populations at heightened risk. We are also expect a mix of cases to be reviewed by the board that will encompass a wide range of impacted vulnerable groups. The fourth action, to handle content removals and users' data requests with transparency and consistency. So this speaks to the same point that was raised in the second action point, but specifically with regards to transparency, all decisions will be published on our website whilst protecting the identity and privacy of those involved. The board will also issue an annual report on its work to evaluate how it is fulfilling its purpose and also, very importantly, whether Facebook is living up to its own commitments. And the final action point, to promote the role of women in journalism. So whilst the board is yet to finalize the criteria for cases it will select, which will be done on a rotating basis, this could well be an area that the board chooses. So regarding actions proposed for self-regulatory bodies, whilst the Oversight Board is such an entity, as a new institution, it does not have the evolved mandate that many press councils have developed over time. As such, it does not have a role specifically to resource or to provide training or practical support or advocacy. Nevertheless, I personally want to support the action that calls for all actors to join forces to advance the implementation of safety standards and other working conditions for female journalists, as the guide specifically calls for. And with that, I'll say thank you, and Kristen, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you for that very, very, very clear presentation and the relationship to the guide. I will go back to, you were talking about, of course, the internet intermediaries, and then mentioning the chapter on journalist organizations and self-regulatory bodies, which is a very specific governance perspective, self-regulatory bodies of media, and very important to create media policy that is participatory in a country where peers speak to peers and also to politicians. I will exit that. So by this, I would argue that you actually seen more than, you met by now more than more than half of the chapters in this publication has been discussed, and we have a few questions to the panelists or to the presenters, I would say. And please continue to ask questions. And as you've seen from the chat where Julie has described how you do, send a message to Q&R request, or in case you want to pose a question, and also you can say if you want to speak, express the question yourself. And we have our first question that I think is addressed to Ms. Hanna Stjärne, and it's from Christine Ram from the International Association for Women in Radio and Television. So Christina, could you please put your video and microphone on and pose your question?
Yes, hello, thank you. I'm listening with very big interest because we are actually planning a meeting in Norway that we've got financial support from Focus, an umbrella organization for women NGOs here in Oslo, about just this very question, but how do we counter harassment on female journalists? So I may contact some of you again to see if I can have some more information and maybe some participants to the meeting. But what I wanted to address you now is about a free downloadable handbook that the International Association of Women in Radio and Television launched in 2017. It's free to download on our home pages. It's been supported by UNESCO, and it's published in English and Arabic, and it's being used in several security trainings by our very competent trainer Aber Sadi, an Egyptian journalist now actually working in Berlin. So may I send the link to the book so you can distribute to everybody? It's been also published in Arabic, but I think most of you want the English.
Please, Christina, put it in the chat. You could put the link in the chat and everybody will be able to access it.
Thank you.
Do you have a question to?
Not yet. I have to absorb this.
Okay. So thank you very much. And then I will leave the floor to Mr. Patrick Penninch of the Council of Europe.
Thank you so much. I think this is comes in such a excellent timing. I think by now we know all the facts in a way. But as you entitled the publication very well, it is time to walk the talk. We know that, and the Council of Europe has published quite a number of materials on the issue as well. Namely, in 2017, we interviewed 1,000 journalists. Half of them were female journalists about the psychological pressure they experienced, where almost 70% said that they experienced denigration, humiliation, including by public authorities, intimidation, bullying, belittlement, and also the exposure of deeply personal aspects of people's private life through smear campaigns, attacks on their reputation and credibility, the so-called doxing, the surveillance resulting in publication of personal aspects, of intimate aspects of their private lives. We know that cyberbullying is at least as serious as physical bullying. And online smear campaigns, they spread fast and far. So it becomes even particularly threatening when it incites to actual physical violence. And there, my friends, I think it is important to recall that justice delayed is justice denied. Protection is no use if it's only on paper. And we also know that impunity kills. Your previous speakers recalled some of the situations, and we just now recently published a book called A Mission to Inform, in which we gave the floor to 20 investigative journalists to speak about what was happening to their lives through the intimidation that they were receiving, sometimes unfortunately also leading to their death. So it's important that we do not only protect on paper. It is no use to be only on paper. We also need to do it in fact. We know that impunity kills. We know the facts, but states have undertaken to implement their commitments. And there also the international organizations such as the Council of Europe and the OSCE need to work hand in hand to make this real. I think we need to be able to counter what is happening. We need to be able to take action, and that we also have to ensure that our states, participating states, live up to their commitments. Also at the Council of Europe, we just published another implementation guide, how to protect journalists and other media actors. I think all of these materials are available online, and I would suggest, and thank you once again for this wonderful initiative, that we should be able to work very closely together to look into the subject matter and to find very concrete strategies to counter what is happening. And the Walk the Talk is one of the good examples of this. So thank you very much for organizing this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Penninch from Council of Europe to say these kind words. And I would like to tell you all that the publication that Christine Ram was describing is actually in the publication, our brilliant resource guide with both examples and resources of per chapter. So now I will ask, there are some questions. Please continue to pose questions to us by addressing Q&A in the chat. I think here's the question to Hanna Schärner of Swedish Television. Are there ever grounds for broadcasters to withdraw reports by women journalists who are facing threats? What do you say?
No, I mean, our basic principle is, of course, that we could report on anything, but that we have a big responsibility to ensure that all our employees are safe when reporting. So we try to make other measures before to ensure that we could report, and of course that our female journalists also could report about almost anything. But what we have experienced the last years is that we have to do a lot of work sometimes. We have to do this planned courage, as I talked about, where we really prepare ourselves for some, when we publish some stories, and we protect our employees. So there's a lot of work with security right now, but so far I shouldn't say that we really have avoided to publish things. We have just done it in a different way and more planned.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Colette Hefner. Colette, please introduce yourself, pose your questions, but first you have to unmute yourself and put on the video.
Hello everyone, thank you for having this presentation today. I am Colette Hefner from International Media Support. I have the role of Global Safety Advisor, and we do a lot of research at International Media Support. And my question is posed to Silvia Cuchero and all others, referring to the gaps in research. I was wondering if you can just take a little bit of time and identify, in your opinion, what are the gaps in research that need to be addressed right here and now for us in civil society, and also to work together with other universities specializing in this as well, as you noted. Thank you.
Thank you, Colette. And Silvia, would you like to take that, the ball, so to say?
Sure.
Would you like to answer?
Sure. Thank you so much, Colette, for that question. And actually, that's a very, very relevant question, because as I was mentioning during my presentation, obviously online harassment and abuse is somewhat, I mean, a recent issue, obviously, just because internet did not exist or we were not using social media platforms now, like just 15 or 10 years ago. So there is really a lot to research on. So I think there is one part that is good, positive, good news. There is, I think in recent years, there has been a lot of research, and that's very good. But if you ask me about some gaps that I might have identified for writing this research guide, for example, I think there is a need to do more research at the national level. There are very good and very interesting research at the global level. But I think we really need to look at the national level too. There are some countries where there has been some studies. For example, there is an organization called AMWIC that has done a study on online harassment and abuse against women journalists in Kenya. There is also an organization now, Fundación Carisma, with a network of women journalists in Colombia, that they're doing a specific research in Colombia. So I think that's, to me, the first gap that we need to address. And in this regard, for example, intergovernmental organizations, regional intergovernmental organizations, I think can provide support for that to happen, to make sure that there is this type of research at the national level, because as we all know, and especially in this conversation that is happening at a regional intergovernmental organization, there are obviously recommendations that can be done on general terms, I mean, like at the global or regional level, but in the end, the implementation takes place at the national level within a very, very concrete social context, cultural context, economic context. And so if we really want to address that at that level, which is the place where, I mean, where we need to address it, we need more research at that level. So if I would have to choose one, I think this would be the one. If I have to choose the second one, I think I would go to, there has been, of course, because this is pretty recent, I mean, in a way, online harassment and abuse. we have been doing a lot of things, and some of them, it seems that they have been pretty successful, but I think there is a need also to study, do case studies. What has worked and why? So we can extract lessons learned from that. And what hasn't worked and why. So I think those are the two areas where I would look at right now. Thank you.
So Sylvia, please stay with me for a while, because you, let's share. You're not only, you are working now with as head of protection of journalists and human rights defenders of Article 19, and you also worked a lot on with other civil society actors. And now we're talking about research, the need for research, thanks to Colette Hefner's question. Let's see where we have it. Yeah, I'm going to the next one. Here we have it. In one of the chapters actually addressing data collection and research. Could you say a few words about this chapter, please?
About the chapter on CSOs and educational institutions?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure, of course. So there is chapter 9, it's about civil society organizations and educational institutions. So one of there we propose we have 4 proposed actions, let's say, on what CSOs and academia can do either individually or in cooperation. And I say this in cooperation because actually this is a very important part of this chapter. I have worked for civil society organizations for many years. I'm also part of some research centers at the university, at 2 universities. And I think there is really much more to do on working together. And one of the things that I said during my presentation, and I think that is crucial, when you work in a civil society organization, you are dealing in your everyday life with the issues, with the problem, with the real life of people, that, in this case, women journalists that are being the subject of online harassment and abuse. And when you are working with that, there are many questions that come to your mind that need an answer, and sometimes getting that answer really requires to cooperate with academia, because it's academia who has the expertise to actually answer those answers the best way. So that's why I want to highlight from this chapter that there is really a call to try to cooperate more between these 2 goals. And that's as a cross-cutting recommendation. Otherwise, what the civil society organizations chapter talks to too, it's one about monitoring attacks. Civil society organizations are probably one of the organizations, well, together with professional associations probably, that have worked more on monitoring attacks against journalists and against women journalists. And they have data and information that has been done for the last 20, 25 years. And the role, the importance of monitoring and having information and data is crucial, because that then is, of course, it's used to understand the problem. If you don't have that data, you cannot really understand the problem, but also is used for evidence-based advocacy. And then go to states and say, look, this is what's happening. So this is what we are suggesting because we have this information. We know that this is what is happening because we are doing monitoring. So in that regard, one of the actions that we propose for CSOs is strengthening this part of monitoring, ensuring that it has a gender approach and that it includes also online harassment and abuse, even though monitoring online harassment and abuse is a little bit, might be some, challenging because of the prevalence. Yeah.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you very much. And I understood from my colleagues that I actually shared the wrong view. I'm really sorry about that. But the proposed actions can be found in the booklet and in this poster where everybody can download on the webpage in A3 format. Just a repetition. I'd like to ask a question to Monica. It's a question from the floor, and please continue to pose questions to the Q&A request in the chat. I will post. There's a question for Monica and see if we can ask them this. Do you know any countries doing more on the legislative and executive levels against gender-based abuse online against journalists than others? Would you see that there are any models that you can use as example? Maybe that's a tricky question, Monica, and we also have some suggestions in the book, but please go ahead and try.
Thank you very much for the question. As I can see a lot of participants from different countries, I'm not very much into recommending only one country, I would say, because it's really very tricky actually to do that. But maybe I would go back to my presentation and I would mention several countries which actually propose actions on different levels and focuses. So I already mentioned, for example, France, which have amended its criminal or penal code for being more focused on online harassment, but it's because that actually they made their analysis and they found out that it already covers several different kinds of behavior, but the group online harassment by the several individuals within the virtual space was not covered, so they amended it. So I would say, but it is not a holistic approach for every other country, because maybe the penal code or criminal code or of say first you need to go really into detail of your own national legislation and then to focus on what is missing. Especially I would say, and I think that I haven't mentioned that also in most of the legislation what is missing is also this kind of gender perspective that actually we know from all these numbers we already heard that 2 of 3 or even more female journalists already experience this kind of online harassment. But we still don't see it as an aggravating factor in our criminal codes or in other civil actions or administrative ones. And I think that we should also focus on that more. What I would maybe suggest for the countries is not to only focus on the criminal codes or criminal punishments, because it's not being recommended by Council of Europe or by the international human rights agencies, because we still want to have this free flow of freedom of information and freedom of speech. So I would say focus more also on the possible civil actions or administrative actions, or maybe that is one thing I can mention, but I need just a second to search for it, but I think it was Ireland actually who suggested, but I may be mistaken, but I think it was Ireland that who suggested actually non-legislative solution, which was actually focused on the separate independent body enforcement. So this is, I'm sorry, I really cannot now find the country, but I can also touch upon it in the chat later. But I would say maybe you can also, you don't only need the legislative steps, but you can also think of different task forces like independent bodies, which can be much more quicker and to respond much more responsively than the legislation and the judiciary, which can be, as we heard, justice delayed is justice denied. So maybe you can also think of these other perspectives.
Thank you very much, Monica, for this reflection. And I'd like to say that there is an analysis of different legislation and how it's been addressed, made by the office and together with the International Press Institute, that is referred to in the resource guide, and it's also on our website of the Office of Representative Freedom on Media. I'd like to ask a question to Thomas Hughes on the Oversight Board. Do you have any suggestions of what states can do related to internet intermediaries? Internet intermediaries are very global, and often in a different country it can be difficult for a state to relate to them and to address them. Could you please share your thinking about that?
Kristen, thank you for the question. You know, I think the type of independent self-regulatory body that the Oversight Board is, I really think that's the type of institution that states should be encouraging social media companies and intermediaries to create. It's the type of model which has been created for press regulation through press councils, and in many countries functions extremely effectively. So I think this is the model to be replicated for social media. There's obviously an overarching concern here that statutory regulation of online content, because we're not only dealing with press freedom issues here, but we're also dealing with individual freedom of expression. So statutory regulation of individual freedom of expression can or could well be excessive. So there is a danger there of what that may look like. So again, where possible, if independent self-regulation functions well, and as I say, I hope the Oversight Board is going to be a very strong example of where this can function well, then those are the models that should be desirable.
Thank you very much. And before I hand over for the concluding remarks to my director, Jürgen Heisel, I'd like to ask Hannah Herner one more question. You said before that you plan for courage. It's not getting better, it's getting worse. But to look at the positive side, one thing that you enabled at SVT the last years, and quite difficult, is not comparable with different media organizations in Sweden, is to enable 56% of female managers at manager decision-making levels, not only at unit level, but also all the way up to your level. Could you reflect a little bit about what actual change that makes of the content and of the planning of courage model that you implement?
Well, at SVT, as I said, 56% of the managers in the company are female, and I think we have sort of a more equal planning maybe in the newsroom, and an including environment. Some years ago, we experienced that quite a few of the female managers would quit their jobs earlier than the men did. They didn't stay for so long as we expected as managers in their positions. So we did quite a lot looking into sort of the culture, what could affect them, what could be sort of the reason that they didn't want to stay as managers. And we managed to change the development. So right now, the female and male managers are staying equally long, which is good. So I think that we sometimes have to think about sort of the culture in the newsroom too. And then the work with planned courage is really growing for us, because we really want to be able to publish whatever is journalistically important, not having to look into the consequences in that sense that they could stop us from publishing what we want. So we work a lot with this planned courage thing, and that is equally, I mean, both female and male managers are working with the planned courage. And then sometimes when it comes to the like female presenters that are more exposed than the male presenters, we of course try to protect them in different ways. If they have made a controversial, we could sort of take care of their social media accounts, answering on their behalf, protecting them. Sometimes they shouldn't even see what's going on there. So we sort of try to help them in sensitive times and sensitive areas. And then the situation that I described with Nikki Nilander, the news anchor that was threatened just recently, when that happened, our head of news, she wrote an article in a very sharp sense, pointing out that this was really, really unacceptable. And that was also published widely in Sweden, among other media companies too. So when there are really, really serious threats, we raise our voice and we talk about it.
Thank you. We have a little bit of time, so I will invite one more last question. I'm not sure to whom though, but I invite Laima Birstunaite from the delegation of Lithuania of the OSCE to Vienna. Could you please ask your question and who you would like to direct it to? Yeah. Unmute yourself and show your video, please.
I hope you see me. Do you?
We see you. Please go ahead. The floor is yours, Laima.
I'm Laima Burshnaite, a member of Lithuanian delegation in Vienna. I would like first to thank the Office of Representative on Freedom for the work done on safety of journalists, and the priority the office is attaching to the safety of journalists as a whole. As a representative of state committed to freedom of expression and media freedom, we really think that those publications that a reform is making, and the one that is published today, is really important and will help combating the relations taking online against women journalists. What was also highlighted by the speakers, the violence against women is prevailing online and offline. For successful fight, we think that against violence and harassment against female journalists, there is a need to have a shifted public attitude towards intolerance to any violence against women, including online. I would be interested to hear from speakers what role of men you see in combating these particular threats faced by female journalists. What action can participating states take to include men voicing the support for female journalists and changing the attitude of society? I would like to hear whoever from the speakers may answer and share their views. Thank you.
So who would like to answer Laima's question? Maybe I should give it to Thomas then, as a man. Thomas Hughes, could you please reply, give us your reflection on the topic?
Well, I think it's obviously equally important for men to speak up on this issue as well. There's obviously the threat to individuals, to colleagues, to friends, just to others that needs to be addressed, and that is that has no gender orientation as to whether you feel compelled to take up the issue of whether these threats exist or where these threats exist, excuse me. But then there's also the wider question of the impact of these threats have on media freedom, on us all, on society, on democracy in general. You know, they're silencing very important voices. So, you know, I think the responsibility rests equally with all to raise their voice and to address these issues, and to do so in coordination, and to do so with vigor and urgency.
Thank you very much. There is a what do you say, habit within OSCE to, when there is a panel, to ask everybody to say a few concluding remarks at the end of the session. So I would like to ask, in the order of appearance today, each one of the speakers to please say something in short about either the topic itself, forward-looking, or about the chapter or the book that you have had an opportunity to read before most of the audience have read it. So please start with Silja.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. So as a concluding remark, I would say that online harassment and abuse against women journalists is not only a matter of silencing journalism. It is a matter of silencing women. So I think this is why addressing this issue of online harassment and abuse in the long term requires to put in place and implement strong gender equality policies. It starts with that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I invite Hanna Stjärne of Swedish Television, the CEO of Swedish Television.
I think that the empowering of female journalists is something that we have to work with every day. We do it at the media companies, but also it's a responsibility for the society as a whole. And I'm really looking forward to the process towards actually a sharpened legislation in Sweden. And even in Sweden, who is very high on the ranks when it comes to press freedom, I think that this is needed. And I think that it's needed in other countries too.
Thank you very much. And I invite Monika Hanisch from Czech Republic.
Thank you. Regarding from my point of view, I would say that actually one big part lays on effective legislation, law enforcement and judiciary to show not only to female journalists themselves, but also to the society as a whole that the topic is crucial for nowadays, for actually having this open democratic discussion. And I would say that they should really show the discouragement for the possible perpetrators of online threats or intimidation, that actually there are effective tools how to combat with it, because there is their active burden of the states actually to fight for journalistic freedom, for their privacy, and that their voices are not actually silenced.
Thank you. And finally, Thomas Hughes of the Oversight Board.
Thank you. I would really focus on the need for a joined up approach. If it's not coordinated between lawmakers, law enforcement, civil society, media institutions, social media companies, there will always be a weak link. There will always be some point in this that's not being properly addressed. So I think coordination is absolutely essential.
Thank you very much. And there are actually a few examples of precisely that from the Netherlands and from other countries available if you want to read. Thank you very much, all the presenters. I will now invite Mr. Jürgen Heisler, the Director of the Office of Representative of Freedom of Media.
Thank you very much, Christine. And I have the honor now to wrap up our 2 hours of discussion around safety of female journalists online. And I would like to start by thanking all our guests and partners in this important endeavor who joined us today. Dear Sylvia, many thanks for a very comprehensive presentation of the new software resource guide. And many thanks to our excellent panelists for insights into this important topic. Your examples have really been very creative and very concrete, and I think they're a fantastic basis for our work forward. Discuss forward towards a common gender comprehensive approach to tackle online harassment. We have presented 40 concrete steps for key stakeholders to end online harassment and abuse of women journalists, as well as counter impunity for such attacks. And due to the limited time, we could not really go into all the various actions, but I would also like to draw your attention to the full resource guide, which is accessible at the webpage of the Representative on Freedom of the Media. And I would really like to invite everybody to spend some more time and look into the entire guide. I would also like to thank all of you for participating in this event. By engaging in forward-looking discussions and by sharing your perspectives, you have contributed to our common effort to improve the safety of female journalists online. During the past, we have learned about various good practices and very concrete examples. We've seen a promising overview of initiatives that can make a difference in government, business, media, and civil society. Just to name a few, some authorities have already started to include the protection of journalists in national policies and legislation. They have developed national response mechanisms, have trained law enforcement professionals to deal with online harassment, and they have conducted nationwide assessments. At the non-state level, internet intermediaries, and we've heard a lot about this today, have introduced services to prevent online harassment with content removal policies and reporting mechanisms to counter online hate without restricting freedom. The media are working on mechanisms both to prevent and to respond to online attacks against journalists and support those who have been subjected to such abuse. Since the start of the SoftJoe project in 2015, we have seen increased awareness and increasing political will to improve the safety of women journalists. In 2015, and Christine started her presentation with it, the OSCE participating states explicitly committed themselves once more to ensure the safety of journalists while acknowledging the distinct risks faced by women journalists and recognizing that safety of journalists does not only mean absence of physical harm, but must also entail legal, economic, psychological aspects and digital safety. However, while such documents are without doubt very valuable, there remains an implementation gap. And we have therefore developed this resource guide as a tool to provide all stakeholders with guidance for concrete actions that need to be taken and on how to implement them. We hope that the list of good practices that was just presented will actually start to grow longer in the months to come. Resource Guide also initiates a next phase of the Office's Soft Joe project, which will focus from now on more intensively on the implementation of the proposed actions and thus the actual realization of online safety for women journalists. During this second phase of the Soft Joe project, we want to work with all key actors to implement the proposed actions of the Resource Guide and its resources. We plan to engage with all relevant actors, both on the local and regional levels, including through capacity building initiatives and workshops that will discuss the roles and responsibilities of specific stakeholders across the entire OSCE region. While it remains crucial to promote discussion and enhance awareness, we believe that the time has come to improve the actual situation for women journalists so that they can work without fear or retaliation. The second phase of the Soft Joe project will therefore have a hands-on approach to assist OSCE participating states and state actors to respond to the challenges faced by female journalists and to develop effective measures to protect and enable their full participation, both online and offline. Online attack and harassment of female journalists are a threat to everyone. It must therefore be resolved, and many have underlined it today, collectively with all the means that we have available. Providing a multi-stakeholder approach, this resource guide does provide key actors with a selection of the most relevant and achievable steps. Let me recall it once more and call on all of us. It is time to walk the talk. My promise is that our office will continue to do everything it can to help you succeed in this endeavor. Many thanks. Thanks for joining us, and we are very much looking forward to continue our joint work together with you. Thank you.